So thank you very much for joining us. Today's session is on the issue of the SDGs in foreign policy, essentially why we need a foreign policy approach to addressing the SDGs, and we've got an excellent panel lined up for you today. But before we move on to our panel, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Dr. Christoph Heusgen, the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations, who will offer some words of introduction. So Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. I also say I admire the resilience of you, first of course with regard to the weather, but also following the HLPF and seeing how many events take place, and I can imagine that this is not the first event you are participating in today, so I very much admire your patience, your dynamic, your interest in this. And we come to a topic which of course for somebody who comes from the foreign policy establishment is very pertinent, and that is the relationship between the SDGs and foreign policy. When I arrived here almost a year ago, of course the focus is on security issues. The focus is on the preparation for the Security Council, for our campaign, and then the topics that you are dealing with was not that much on the agenda, I must admit. But now through the HLPF, at least from the German perspective, record participation in the HLPF, this has become very high on the agenda, and by dealing with the individual subjects that you have on your agenda, the relevance of what you're doing has become clearer to me, and also the link between foreign policy and the SDGs, the implementation of the SDGs has become more relevant. Now, let me start from the German perspective. When we let's start with the Security Council. When we applied for the Security Council, we did that because we say that Germany has something to say. Germany is contributing. We are the second largest donor to the UN system, and we feel responsible for developments, and therefore said, well, we want to make an impact in the Security Council, trying to shape foreign policy. Now, by looking at the agenda, we have seen that on the Security Council, and the members of the Security Council have a very narrow interpretation of security. And from our perspective, we need definitely to take a larger perspective. And in doing this, in trying to achieve this, we hope that we'll be able, or we will come directly or indirectly in touch with the topics of the different objectives of the SDGs. To be more specific, Germany will have two presidencies during the Security Council. One will be in April 2019, and the second one will be in June in 2020. And during this time, we would like to actually have, as I said, bring a broader perspective of security into on the table of the Security Council. In April, we'll try to have the topic of women, peace and security, the topic of sexual violence against women. We are vice chair of a group in New York of promotion of African women leaders, so we want to bring this topic on the agenda. And of course, gender equality, the possibilities for women to participate in political life, to participate in economic life, all this is enshrined in the SDGs. And by promoting this issue, we also believe that we will be able to contribute to a security, to the guarantee of security, or to improve the security situation in countries when you have a stronger participation of women, when the rights of women are protected. The same is another topic we are looking at, is children and armed conflicts. How you treat children, how children can get an education, how children are kept out of these conflicts. This contributes to the development of a society. This contributes to a society to be civil, to be peaceful, to pursue the goals that we have in the SDGs. And the one which is perhaps most obvious is the objective that we have for us in 2020 in June, when we look at the topic of climate and security. We are of the belief that climate change, that climatic developments in a certain region have repercussions on security, and therefore this is something that foreign policy needs to act upon and tries to also, and this we will try to do, engage the Security Council on this. Our Swedish colleagues just a week ago were successful in having the issue of climate change and security on the agenda of the Security Council, and we will try to build on this when we come to our presidency. So the relationship between topics that are relevant for foreign policy to preserve peace and security are topics that are very relevant for the discussions that you have in the HIPF and discussions on the implementation of the SDGs. So therefore I believe what is done here during the HIPF is very important, very relevant to our security. When in 2015 the SDGs were adopted, when you look today into the substance of it, when I read some of the details, I'm still surprised that actually the international community agreed on this. When you look at the details, you wonder how is. I say this because the background that we all live in, where right now multilateralism is in danger. The Paris Agreement is in danger. We just adopted the migration compact here, with also not everybody participating in it. In this respect, I'm very happy today that there are the SDGs, that this is universally accepted as a goal, that this is something we can relate to, and we can also relate to it in day-to-day politics, and when countries question certain issues or certain claims that we do, also with regard to human rights, with regard to the respect of minorities, with regard to the respect for legal provisions wherever. I think this is very important that we have the SDG. What I find, and I would like to close with this, from my opening remarks, you will have gathered that I was not really an expert in SDGs issues. I've become an instant expert during these last days. What I think is important is that we carry this message from New York, and we carry this message from those in our capitals who deal with the issues into our countries. I think what we need to do is to not only have the fantastic discussions here, but we have to carry this into our countries, in the capitals, in the communities. Germany had 3 mayors of Berlin, of Bonn, of Darmstadt here. We have members of parliament, and it's very important that the members of parliament then carry that into their constituencies, so that the goals, the policies to pursue this become something very, very general, and the people know about this, think about this, participate and contribute to implementing this, and this is much more important, and I think much more useful than that our people are following some populists. So thank you very much. I pass over back to you, Janina, and and listen to part of the discussion. And again, thank you very much for joining us tonight in the German House.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So, as I mentioned, we have an excellent panel lined up for you today. Our panelists will give short inputs of 8 minutes, and we will then open the floor for questions and answers. So we'll have a lot of time to get the expertise from what I can see is a very knowledgeable audience. But before I hand over to our panelists, I'd like to take a few moments to set the scene, to essentially give a bit of context and give you the rationale for why we're here today, why we, as adelphi, have put out this paper, which is there on the side table, essentially making the case for why the SDGs are a prerequisite for foreign policy, and why or how foreign policy should and could be a vehicle for achieving the SDGs. We argue that this dependence, this interaction between the SDGs and foreign policy hasn't been sufficiently broached by foreign policy actors to date, and that it should be. So why have we got to this position? How have we reached this hunch or conclusion? We have two parts to this answer. On the one hand, foreign policy activities, be it the de-escalation of conflict, be it promoting international trade, addressing violent extremism, this depends on human development. It depends on rule of law, on governance, on resilient societies that can deal with disputes and resolve them without resorting to conflict. This is essentially what the SDGs are about. These are the foundations of sustainable development, and it's only upon this that foreign policy can build. So that's one part of the argument. The other part is that the SDGs affect geopolitics. All the transformational change that we aspire to through meeting the SDGs, there's not, it's not incremental change, it's transformational, it's not national, it's global. This implies a geopolitical implication, and this essentially alters geopolitical dynamics and affects peace and stability for the better or potentially for the worse. So this is something we need to consider. And we're already seeing this, the shift from fossil fuel dependent economies to low carbon economies, the shift from small scale agriculture to large scale industrial agriculture in our efforts to meet zero hunger, the move from centralized government structures to decentralized government structures in our efforts to promote resilient cities. These are all shifting the power balances and changing the politics, essentially changing or redrawing the global map of political influence. And so in a nutshell, we're saying that both implementing the SDGs, or both not implementing the SDGs, or implementing the SDGs without taking account of a proactive foreign policy driven approach can have a negative impact, can be detrimental to peace, to geopolitical stability, to a host of other foreign policy goals. And so what we need, or what we propose, is careful and deliberate diplomacy to ensure that these changes, these transformational changes that we expect of the SDGs, to ensure that these do not have unintended negative consequences on stability. So how do we come to this position? In the paper, we map out the relevance of SDGs to foreign policy, and we take the six SDGs under review at the current HLPF as entry points, and we look then at how these SDGs affect, or positively or negatively, support or undermine a range of foreign policy or key foreign policy priorities. And when I say key foreign policy priorities, we have identified 6 policy areas which we have identified to be illustrative or emblematic of global foreign policy priorities of the moment. So these areas are firstly the prevention of forced migration and displacement, particularly relevant at the moment after the Global Compact has been signed. conflict prevention and stabilization, reducing humanitarian need, countering terrorism and violent extremism, promoting financial foreign investment and trade, and the sixth is geopolitical stability. So based on these 6 areas, we go through the SDGs and look at the ways in which SDG progress can support or undermine these goals, and also how progress on around these foreign policy areas can affect the SDGs. In the interest of time, I won't go through comprehensively our analysis, but I would urge you to take a look at our report, and I hope that you'll find some interesting analysis here. But I'll just give you a few examples to give you a flavour of the kinds of implications that we're talking about. So if I take SDG 7 on energy, for example, this is already having implications on the geopolitical or the foreign policy priority of geopolitical stability. This move from towards decarbonized economies is shifting power from previously more influential oil and gas producing states towards new dynamics. Growing resource input requirements for renewable technologies, for example, is changing the balance of power. It's potentially reducing past conflict dynamics, but it could. Well, we're already seeing that it's also creating new rivalries and tensions. Similarly, or to give another example, if I look at SDG 11, resilient cities, here we can see implications on the foreign policy efforts around conflict prevention and stabilization, shifting power from
power savings, powering off, cancel,
shifting power from centralized
in 54 seconds,
the room being to
powering
self-detonate.
off in 49 seconds,
That's quite ominous.
powering off in 44 seconds.
I think we can carry on. So SDG 11, if we look at the implications of this move from centralized governance structures to decentralized power systems, this is shifting rural-urban dynamics, potentially in favor of cities, but maybe to the detriment of rural communities. And this can be destabilizing without the requisite governance structures in place, particularly within these new urban centres, to be able to deal with this transition. And also, there needs to be enhanced coordination between the centre and the peripheries. If we stay with SDG 11, there's also implications on countering violent extremism and terror. We can see the rapid urbanisation, particularly in post-conflict contexts, and this is linked to youth unemployment and the trend of or increased vulnerability of youth to criminality and engagement in illicit activities. And there are trends, or we can see also that this is linked to increased vulnerability to recruitment into armed opposition groups or into radicalization or extremism. So connecting the urban poor to the urban economies, to institutions, to services is fundamental to addressing the livelihood insecurity that's at the heart of this issue, which is then core to the foreign policy priority of countering extremism and terror. So there we can see how the progress on the SDGs is absolutely critical to achieving some of the foreign policy priorities that are key to or at the heart of our political processes at the moment. So our takeaway message is that foreign policy needs to better anticipate and steer the geopolitical implications of the SDGs in order to minimise these unintended negative risks and maximise the positive impacts on sustainable development. And for this we need a sustainable foreign policy. This is essentially a process that supports SDG implementation and external action. And for this to happen in a joined up fashion, and for this to happen, we set out in our paper 3 steps. The first is to analyse the knock-on consequences of the SDGs on foreign policy and to better then integrate the SDGs into foreign policy strategies. Effective implementation of the SDGs requires cognizance of politics, of geopolitics, which affect them and which, of course, they also affect. All SDG actions have geopolitical implications, and yet there's nothing in the current monitoring requirements or the current indicators of the SDGs to capture any of these positive or negative implications. And of course, there are very clear political reasons for this, but this is incredibly important. There needs to be a better understanding of foreign policy implications of the SDGs and vice versa. And based on this understanding, foreign policy strategies can be better aligned to make sure that they do no harm, and where relevant can actually proactively, constructively address some of the SDG goals that we're looking to achieve for the better. An important step here would be a rigorous and regular analysis of projections on different levels and different quality of SDG implementation on foreign policy, and also an assessment of trends in geopolitics. For example, this new trade war between the US and China, or between the US and Europe, and understand what these trends mean for SDG progress. And this would help us, this kind of a process or analysis would help us identify potential risks, potential black swans before they bite us, and help us to head off these kind of risks. And it's not just the negative, it's not just about preventing risk, it will also help us identify these elusive double dividends, things like this peace dividend that we often talk about, where there are these synergies between sustainable development goals and foreign policy. We're just not able to see them, we're not capturing them. And this kind of cognizance would help us better align strategies to enable greater future synergy. And an outcome of this kind of process would provide us with an as yet lacking reference point and guidance then on how to ensure SDG progress doesn't inadvertently undermine foreign policy, and that foreign policy can better help or contribute to improvement of the SDGs. Such a process, in short, will give us a roadmap to sustainable foreign policy. So that's the first step. The second step is to employ the whole of the diplomatic toolbox for sustainable development. The SDGs address a global challenge, as you say, Ambassador, for which we need global solutions, and we are in this very dark time of populism, of increased nationalism, and the SDGs are this symbol, this beacon of multilateralism, of what can be done through multilateralism. But for this we need multilateral tools. The SDGs can't be left simply to development ministries, nor can they be seen as kind of technical areas for engagement to be left to specific technical ministries such as environment, energy, or water to then pursue discrete sector-specific technical activities. We need the diplomatic toolbox, and the whole suite of tools should be made available: diplomacy, partnership, mediation, financing, global governance, political dialogue. There's a distinct role for global policy here, and there's also a real role for foreign policy leadership. We've seen, you mentioned Paris, we've seen from the example of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the importance, or the way that foreign policy engagement can work as a catalyst. And I would say it was the climate diplomacy that the French put into, or the international community put into Paris, that really helped catalyze that process and reach that goal that we saw today. Up until then, all the COPs, they just, incremental change, but with real foreign policy leadership, there was this real movement, this step change. And the third step then is, and this is my final point, is to invest in fragile states. Fragile states is where progress is the slowest, yet it's where it's the most needed. SDG 16 on peace comes close to top of the class when it comes to political interest and also funding. Well, although that depends on how you count what's counted under that spend. But progress doesn't reflect this political interest and the money that's going in. And there's a role for foreign policy here. And it's not asking for more, it's not asking for new activities, it's about doing things differently. Much foreign policy action is already taking place in fragile states. But this action doesn't often connect to SDG action. And besides, a lot of this action isn't sufficiently taking account of the particular contextual factors of fragile states. In short, foreign policy action in fragile states is not conflict sensitive. So in addition to better alignment of foreign policy in fragile states with the SDGs, there also needs to be a change in the mode of action of foreign policy in federal states. It needs to be conflict sensitive to ensure that progress on the SDGs is not inadvertently undermined. And there also needs to be a better understanding of how actions under other SDGs than SDG 16 positively or negatively contribute to or affect fragility. And we're not looking at this. This isn't being measured anywhere. This is important for foreign policy goals such as conflict prevention and stabilization, as well as for the SDGs. To paraphrase the USG Amina Mohammed, without peace there can be no development. So a better understanding of and addressing of the knock-on consequences of the SDGs and foreign policy on fragility is key to making progress on the SDGs in federal states. So in a nutshell, that's our paper, and that's the premise upon which we make the case for a foreign policy approach to the SDGs. And so to pick up these issues with far more flair and insight and panache, I will now happily hand you over to our panel. So we will begin with Mr. Dr. Henk-Jan Brinkman, who is the Chief of Policy Planning and Application at the UN Peacebuilding Support Office.
So I need to use this? Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me on this very interesting topic. The SDGs are very close to my heart. I spent about 5 years to get goal 16 in there, and that was a great accomplishment. And that really is gets to my first point. I want to make a couple of points: 2 tenets, 2 trends, 2 lessons, 2 challenges, and 2 solutions. So the first tenet is really maybe very obvious, and Ambassador already referred to it. We wouldn't have the SDGs without foreign policy. The SDGs were negotiated by ministries of foreign affairs, not by sectoral ministers. It was negotiated by missions here, and occasionally, of course, people from capitals, but they overwhelmingly came from ministries of foreign affairs. And it took a long and really very big effort to get there. And it was a very important difference with the Millennium Development Goals from the Millennium Declaration from 2000, which the Millennium Declaration was more or less negotiated by member states, but the Millennium Development Goals were not. They were both basically drawn up by a bunch of UN bureaucrats in the basement across the street. And actually that has as a consequence that it took us 5 years really to get all the member states on board. And NGOs like human rights NGOs who felt that the human rights component was not strong enough. So that's really, really important that we got the foreign ministries and the foreign policy in there, and that they were negotiated by the member states, because now they own them. And that gets me to my second point. Despite this fact, the primary responsibility lies with national governments, with countries, not with other countries outside. So the foreign policy is certainly not the first aspect in terms of the responsibility. That lays very squarely and very explicitly with the countries themselves. But of course, I did a quick count, 39 of the 169 targets have an international or global component. There's a reference to international cooperation, or an international treaty or framework, or international norms, or etc. So there is clearly a very important foreign and international component to that. I want to point to 2 trends that make all of this more important. The first one is that we see a very rapid increase in violent conflict since 2010. It's really reversing a trend that preceded that by about 30 years. And so what we see at the moment is not only an increase in violent conflict, but also they have become much more protracted, they're lasting longer, and much more complex in terms of solving them. Because there are many more non-state actors and there are international components to it. So in this report that we did with the World Bank, the Pathways for Peace, there's a beautiful graph that shows that the number of conflicts that are within countries but have international components have increased from 3 to about 20. And that makes them one of the reasons why we need foreign policy, but also why they have become so complicated. And the number of non-state actors, I think, is very critical because Syria, for example, has more than 1,000 armed non-state groups, as opposed to the period of the Cold War, where in Central America, in Southern Africa, the UN could just put 2 different groups in a room, mediate a peace agreement, put peacekeepers in between, and that was it. The world is not that simple anymore. It's much more complex. So the second trend I want to point to is that already nearly 50% of the world's extreme poor live in fragile or conflict-affected countries, and that will increase to more than 80% if we don't do anything by 2035. So working in conflict and working on conflict is going to be absolutely critical to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 lessons. The first one is, and I think that's where Habib, you arrived just in time, the changes of what development is, the concept of development has broadened tremendously over the last few decades. In the 1950s and 60s, development economists were talking about economic growth. In the 1970s, about basic needs. Human development came on the fore in the 1990s. And in the 2000s, we really started to talk about the link between development and peace. And the G7 Plus and the New Deal, the discussions in INCAF, really played a very important role in making clear what these linkages between peace and development are, and that changed the environment, I think, in which the negotiations took place, and I think that's one of the reasons why we ended up with Goal 16 in the SDGs, and some countries like Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone, Liberia played an incredible important role in the negotiations by saying, this is not a northern agenda. It's not the West imposing this on the South. It's a universal agenda. That's number one. But number 2, it's important to us to have this recognized. The second trend the second trend I mentioned already with the linkage between peace and development. The two challenges I want to mention is, first of all, is the UN has really a huge problem in getting everybody to recognize this. And we have some great resolutions on the Peace Building Architecture Review that has been usually referred to as a Sustainable Peace Resolution that explicitly recognize that the entire UN system has a role in sustaining peace and peace building. But to actually get to that point is a huge challenge. And of course, there are many SDGs that have explicit references to peace or inclusion or justice. Beyond Goal 16, there are actually 36 targets that are somehow related to peace or justice. And inclusion is one of the most important concepts, I think, in the 2030 agenda, and one of the most important entry points in the SDGs to prevent violent conflict and address the fragility and the root causes and drivers of violent conflict. The second the second challenge I want to mention is that we need to move away from the response management, a crisis management position. The international community spent $233 billion over 10 years on just peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, and donor assistance to refugees in donor countries in Europe. And that's an incredible amount of money. And we can't even get $500 million for the Peace Building Fund. And with that, this report clearly shows that prevention works, it's cost effective, and it saves lives and resources. Two solutions. as I started, it's national countries that need to take the driver's seats. And so foreign policy, the United Nations need to support national stakeholders and national actors in these efforts. Foreign policy can play an important role. And secondly, analysis is a very important entry point. So doing the analysis of what are the problems in the country around the CCA, the Common Country Assessment for the UN Development Assistance Framework, for example, is a very important entry point to talk about the SDGs, to talk about what are the problems in the country and how are we going to address them. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's actually the second time that I've heard this pretty harrowing statement about by 2030 or by 2035 we say over 80% of the world's poor will be living in fragile states, and if that's not a call to action, then I don't know what could be. Thank you very much. The challenges are significant. You gave some very interesting and important numbers there, and I think within what you cited as being spent on responses in fragile states, I think only 2% in 2016, 2% of all ODA was spent on conflict prevention, and 10% of ODA was spent on peace building, and that really does show us the importance of shifting this paradigm towards prevention, as you say. So a lot of work to be done. Alexander Müller, you are the Managing Director of TMG, a Sustainable Development think tank. You're formerly the Assistant Deputy Director General of the FAO. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please share with us your insights.
First of all, thanks for inviting me to this important debate. I really think it would be naive not to consider the political or geopolitical implications of the SDGs. And I can build 100% on what my former colleague from the Rome-based agency, WFP, we were there at the same time, has already said. So I'm going to build on what you have presented. First of all, there would have been no SDGs without a political process. And the driver was coming from the global south. It were a country like Costa Rica and others who during the implementation of the MDG said, you guys from the north, you also have to change. It's not only about you continue business as usual and we do sustainability, you have to change your development pathway, and I think we always have to have it in mind. If we in the developed countries don't change our development pathways, the developing world is not going to do it. So there is the first lesson I think we have to learn. We have to take the SDGs very seriously. We have to change, and we have obligations in order to do it. The second issue I would like to present is, again, looking back to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. There was no MDG on energy in it, for geopolitical reasons. You have described the process of developing the MDGs very well. It was not possible to develop MDG on energy because there was no political process to find out what can we do on energy. And I think this was one of the really big ideas of Ban Ki-moon, to invite 25 people at a time when the MDGs were still under implementation to discuss what could be a possible solution to come to an energy SDG. At this time it was not called energy, but everybody knew that there will be a follow-up process, and without energy, development is not possible, and therefore it was very clear that energy has to be high on the agenda. And without political debates on how to solve the energy problem, we would not have achieved the sustainable energy for all debate. And I could tell long stories about why we did not reference the energy SDG to climate change. For political reasons, it was not possible because the oil exporting countries said, sorry, you are not going to interrupt our development model, and therefore we ended up in sustainable energy for all. And therefore, again, the second item, if you want to understand how the SDG on energy has been developed, you have to do it through the lens of foreign policies and geopolitics. My third item is implementation of the SDGs is very closely linked to national interests. Over there,
Right.
over there in the streets, at the UN headquarters, very often you get the impression that implementation of SDGs is only a technical issue or an issue of goodwill. It is not. There are a lot of political interests involved in it. And I think we have to carefully define what are the interests behind one way or the other to implement the SDGs. There is no one way you can, and I've been asked to talk about agriculture, you can achieve SDG 2. There are different ways to achieve SDG 2, and there are always political and geopolitical issues involved. And I would like to refer to...
That we are in.
I don't think if this is agreement or disagreement, but...
I think that's the other side of it.
That's the other side of yes. They have a strong impact on our microphone. So I would like to refer to the discussion paper Adelphi and the climate diplomacy has put up, and they were referring to how can we achieve feeding a growing population in the world. And they put an alternative there, and they say either small-scale farmers can do it or industrial agriculture, in a nutshell. I think this is the wrong alternative, because behind is the question of migration. And let me explain you why. We have 1.5 billion small-scale farmers in the world. That's the biggest workforce in the world. Automobile industry has less than 50 million. Farmers is 1.5 billion. So every decision on how to feed the world will have impact on the livelihoods of these people and the number of farmers in the world. And I cannot imagine that in India, for example, where around 50% of the population are employed in agriculture, we can import our development model from Europe or from the United States, because this would mean that hundreds of millions of people would have to leave their livelihoods, would have to leave agriculture, and there is no alternative job market. Which does not mean that I want to protect small-scale farmers as they are today. We need massive investment to increase their yields, to improve their livelihoods, to get land tenure security for these farmers. But if we think there's only one way to follow the European model of agriculture, this would have huge geopolitical implications. And therefore, we need this political debate on how to implement the SDGs. You have introduced our small company, TMG, Think Tank for Sustainability, and of course we are also trying to implement projects on the ground. In Benin, in Burkina Faso, we are working on maybe small-scale projects, looking at how to secure land rights for women, the most vulnerable women, widows. They don't have their land rights. And what we can learn from our small-scale project is that we have to link implementation of SDGs with overarching goals. If we want to decide here in New York only how to implement the SDGs, or if the capitals decide, we are missing the opportunity. And therefore, the lesson we have learned is it depends a lot on the conditions under which you implement the SDGs. And this is again a political or geopolitical issue. If we don't manage to translate the nice word to leave no one behind into consider the political and geopolitical implications of the implementation of SDGs. There are several ways to implement the SDGs. And again, it would be naive not to consider what are the consequences. Coming back to agriculture and feeding a growing population, the African population, now 1.5 billion, will increase up to 4 billion in the medium perspective of the UN, so plus 2.5 billion. I cannot imagine how this can be done without massive migration if we don't invest in small-scale agriculture. So there is a choice. Export the European model or the US-American model, or try to develop a new model for agriculture in order to improve livelihoods, to secure the access to land for small-scale farmers. And this has large implications. And if the implementation of the SDGs would be blind on this question, you could of course say we will have higher yields by bringing hybrid seeds from Europe or United States to Africa to have large-scale farms. But the question of migration will be really huge, and therefore, my last sentence again wrapping up, The political and geopolitical implications have to be considered in the implementation, and this means that we have to have the political debate, and we have to also guide the implementation of the SDGs. One of the side events I participated this afternoon, you could get the impression that eating hamburgers and drinking beer is the best way to achieve the SDGs, because Anheuser-Busch and McDonald's, they presented their way forward. And I try to translate it into what is going to happen in Africa and India if you use this model, and migration will increase rapidly. And therefore, the security issue, Germany in the Security Council, we have to have this debate. And I know that this is a difficult debate to have. You cannot have it with a hammer in your hand, because you have to respect sovereignty of other countries, but we have to consider what are the intended or unintended side effects of implementation of SDGs. And that's the reason why I really like this debate. This is the start of a debate. And if you would talk about water, it would be even more obvious that there's a geopolitical implication of implementing the SDGs. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. If you'll excuse the pun, a lot of food for thought you've given us there, and I think very important for us to understand the political and geopolitical backstory of how the SDGs came about, to then understand how important it is to have this realpolitik lens when it comes to looking at the SDGs. It's not just about goodwill and technical responses. And I think, yes, being in the main event over the road, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of this. So thank you very much. Now, are you happy to speak without the microphone? I don't know if it's...
Yeah, because I was getting a little bit afraid of that microphone. Wondering how it would behave in my hands.
So, Ms. Elizabeth Papa, you are the senior expert representing the European Union delegation to the UN. You are former acting head of the Fragility and Resilience Unit of the EU Director General on Development Cooperation. Can you share with us some of your insights, maybe giving some concrete examples of how the EU uses foreign policy to promote or address some of the SDG goals?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a bit hard to come after two so experienced colleagues who gave really the global outlook, but you had asked me to talk about the EU. And so it's a different perspective a bit, but I hope it matches with what you've heard before. And the first one is about I want to say how we organize, or how we are organized in the EU on SDGs. And the first one is that we really take the universality principle serious. So the main steer for the implementation of the SDG is not on the development side and not on the foreign policy side. It's actually with the first Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Timmermans. And he has brought together a panel of experts, partly from civil society, partly from politicians, partly from the institutions, so people who should really advise the EU on implementation of the SDGs with this universality perspective in mind. And then on our external instruments, they have really come together much more closely in the past years. And that started with the EU Global Strategy that High Representative Mogherini put out in 2016. And it took a distinctively different view on EU foreign policy, recognizing that possibly our impact, that we have to be aware that our impact is maybe not as powerful as we often thought, and that in reality we have to see how we can contribute to peace in the world and multilateralism and other countries achieving their goals. So one of the 5 pillars, and 3 are very important for this. Do you hear me like this, or should I dare now to use this mic? Should I try? Yeah, okay. So there are 3 pillars which are very important for the context of this meeting with respect to the SDGs. So the first one is resilience. So perspective that we should aim to help other countries, partner countries, to build societal and state resilience, and to enable them to prevent, address, and recover from crisis. The second is an integrated approach to conflicts and crisis, which puts a strong emphasis on improving the coherence and coordination of all the EU policies and instruments, including with member states, to go beyond crisis management in order to prevent conflicts and help build longer-term resilience. Development cooperation plays a very key role to achieve this. And the third pillar, which is very relevant, is this clear commitment to multilateralism. And that's where the SDGs have their place. And then a year later, we adopted the new European Consensus on Development. And that is basically built around or mirrored around mirroring the 5 Ps: the people, prosperity, peace, planet, and partnerships of Agenda 2030. And member states, and this is something adopted, our European consensus is adopted not only by the EU institutions, but all the 28 member states. And there is a clear commitment to use development cooperation as part of the full range of policies and instruments to prevent and help resolve conflicts and crises. And then the following year, last year we also adopted a strategic approach to resilience. We had a resilience approach which was more directed towards the most vulnerable people. But now it's more political. It includes economic, energetic, climate, environmental resilience, conflict prevention, forced displacement. And it also makes a shift from crisis containment to addressing the vulnerabilities and the risks at the roots. And what's crucial is the joint analysis, the joint mapping and joint actions and monitoring with member states also. So then a few of the policy tools that we have to promote the SDGs. One, we have a political dialogue with partner countries where the EU head of delegation is in the lead. And because the EU is the largest provider of official development assistance together with member states, if we take us together in the world, this is a very important soft tool for countries. They really consider development assistance as an important subject to discuss in the political dialogue. Another tool is an EU early warning system that we have adopted, and which really ends up with a system-wide attention to countries, regions, and topics that have been identified as carrying serious risk with respect to and significant impact on the EU, as well as the possibility for the EU really to have leverage on these risks. So that brings the whole system together. There are all Director Generals involved. It's not just something which remains in the narrow external relations DGs. Another item is the Kimberley process. It's a global partnership that brings together governments, industry, and civil society with the aim to eliminate trade in conflict diamonds, and the EU has taken the chair in this one. Now, we have also EU missions under the Common Security and Defense budget. 16 in total, 10 civilian and 6 military. And they are largely training, such as for security forces, such as the EUTM Mali or also in Central African Republic. Again, with the view that we want to help the countries to build their resilience and their capacity to deal with crisis and risks. I think I should mention a few more things. One is, for instance, the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa that was adopted in 2016 by EU member states and African states. And that was, of course, triggered by the migration crisis, but it's not only directed towards immediate direct migration context, but really to address the instability in those 3 groups of countries which are most affected. So we put quite a lot of money on that, and the trust fund now has an allocation of something like almost 4 billion euros. And why it was a trust fund to which also others contribute. They do to a more limited extent. The larger part comes from EU instruments, is that we wanted to become more flexible, to be able to react in a more flexible way and faster. We have also now put a lot of importance and money behind attacking violence against women. We have last year committed 500 million in a UN trust fund with several UN agencies to really tackle this really very important SDG on gender and stopping violence against women, and we don't want to look at it in a long-term perspective, but really this is a big push to which we also invite others to participate. And one launch will be in the next UNGA on the Latin American program. Maybe I can say a few more words then afterwards in the discussion, because I wanted to still come to some concrete examples.
Maybe you could just give one.
So we know that the biggest challenge lies with the fragile and conflict-affected states, because if we don't address if we don't manage to tackle the SDGs in those countries, the SDGs will not be achieved. Simple. And there are more. I mean, the fact that the majority of poor live in these countries and that there has been a huge increase, that does not necessarily mean that there are more poor people in the world, no. But there are countries who are able to tackle the challenges and to grow out of poverty to a large extent by their own efforts, if they have good policies in place and a good environment and no conflict, whereas those countries who continue to fall back in conflict, and actually the best predictor of conflict is that you've had a conflict in the past. 90 countries went into conflict, 90% of them had conflicts in the past. And they eradicate their development achievements of years and possibly decades within really just a few months. So also funds are going more in this direction, but they are maybe not used in the best way, to the extent that prevention is receiving such a small percentage. But the big challenge here lies in the nexus, in really bringing together the security, also the humanitarian, human rights, and development. I was in Central African Republic just with the Peace Building Fund just recently, and that is a good example where lack of development or lack of security prevents actually the development support that is also available to be implemented and have results on the ground, and where the lack of development, on the other hand, adds to a persistence of security problems, because people don't see the peace dividend, and they join armed groups and criminal gangs. I want to leave it here. Sorry for taking too much time.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. That was a very rich and a very concrete, specific set of examples that you shared with us on the EU's progress here. And I think it's important and reassuring that the EU's global strategy also takes the principle of universality as its core. So it's not just external, it's also looking at building resilience within the EU member states as well. So it's looking to get its own house in order as well, just as we've been taught to with the SDGs.